Going into the year 2001, it had been 3 years since the release of Crash Bandicoot Warped, and fans were basically starved at this point for another platforming entry that featured Crash and co. going against whatever harebrained plot Cortex had thought up to take over the world. Little did those fans know that in the background, something was cooking, and it was almost ready to be served. Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex started development in the year 2000 by the team Traveller's Tales. Initially under the name Crash Bandicoot Worlds, which was intended to be a free-roaming puzzle-solving adventure, and an idea that would inevitably be revisited in the game Crash Twinsanity. Due to some creative differences and publishing rights between Universal and Sony, Crash Bandicoot Worlds was scrapped after 10 months into development, giving Traveller's Tales only 12 months to recreate the entire game in a linear platforming fashion. This eventually ended up in a rename and reimagining, with The Wrath of Cortex being released in October 2001 for the PS2, January of 2002 for the Xbox, and September of 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, making this game the first ever Crash title to break free from the iron grip of Sony's exclusivity. With another passing of the torch, Crash Bandicoot was ready to live again. But was The Wrath of Cortex truly a step in the right direction, or had Crash Bandicoot strayed off of his jungle path and stumbled into the wilderness? Follow along as we cover it all in a brief retrospective of Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex. The game opens up with Cortex's ship hovering above the Earth as he plans his next devious plot. And by plan his next devious plot, I mean get abused by Uka Uka as he usually does. Uka Uka explains that in terms of their successes, well, they've had no successes, and Crash needs to be eliminated as soon as possible if they want to get back on the proverbial saddle. Engine points out the obvious, stating that no matter what they do, Crash always wins, and Tropy then asks Cortex how his new secret weapon is coming along. Cortex explains that he's missing the last crucial element, which is a power source strong enough to charge it. This prompts Uka Uka to remember that there are entities known as the Elementals that have immense energy, capable of charging whatever Cortex is working on, and put an end to Crash Bandicoot once and for all. After a quick transition, we pan over to Crash and Coco enjoying their time on the beach, only to be attacked by what appears to be the weather. This leads with Aku Aku leaving and confronting Uka Uka in hyperspace, a returning environment from Crash Bash. Aku Aku asks his brother what he's up to, and he presents his trap card, introducing the 4 elementals and leading an attack on Aku Aku, who promptly escapes. After returning to his home to inform Crash and Coco of the situation, he explains that the only way to seal the elementals away is to collect the elemental crystals, leading them to escape to the portal chamber and planning their next move, which sets the story into motion. Straight away, there are a few things that really stand out to me that I'm not a massive fan of, with the most jarring one being the way the characters are designed. It seems that all the models are too smooth and they come across as almost waxy in their textures. For a long time, the polygons and sharp edges were part of the charm of the Crash series, because it defined features and characteristics and caused them to stand out a lot more, especially when it came to Crash's facial features in previous games. But when you compare those games to The Wrath of Cortex, a lot of the characters just look very stiff. Uka Uka looks great for this entry, because to be honest, it's hard to mess up a piece of wood with a face. But when showing characters such as Engine, he looks like he could be an early 2010s creepypasta character with his own dedicated fanbase. It also seems that a lot of textures were just slapped onto characters, especially when looking at Entropy, whose various clocks that are meant to be part of his body are clearly just textures that don't have any depth to them. This doesn't just apply to the villains either, and affects almost all major models in the game that aren't a mask, with Crash and Coco having very little body language in the way they present themselves and only seem to exclusively move using their necks during cutscenes. I understand that at the time, this was meant to be a generational leap in terms of both consoles and graphical fidelity, but I feel that Traveller's Tales missed a very core element of the games, which was the fact that when it came to Crash Bandicoot, having the characters being so overly animated was a massive part of what made them popular and set them apart from so many others at the time. Thankfully, my criticisms only hold true when it comes to rendered cutscenes, as our transition to gameplay is a much smoother and enjoyable one. Once inside the warp room, Cortex makes a holographic appearance to badger Crash, and uses the opportunity to introduce his new secret weapon, Crunch Bandicoot.
This is the creature who keeps sabotaging your master plan? Ha! You gotta be kidding! I'll exterminate this field rat in no time!
Crunch is everything that Crash Bandicoot isn't: egotistical, bigger, stronger, and capable of actually formulating a sentence, which is a subtle way of showing how much Cortex's science has improved since our first outing in Crash 1. Crunch is voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson, an absolutely iconic voice actor who would go on to voice a plethora of even more iconic characters in later games and movies. Once we're given control of Crash, we begin to notice how fundamentally improved he is to control. With the Wrath of Cortex being released on a new console, so comes with it a new engine and some new physics to have fun with. Crash is noticeably lighter in this game, resulting in higher jumps and a floating-like feel to his controls. This makes him considerably easier to control compared to previous platforming entries, where he felt heavier in terms of weight. I quite like this change. Giving Crash some even lighter jumping mechanics allowed Traveler's Tales to experiment a lot more in terms of platforming, and how difficult they wanted those platforms to be when traversed across. It's not too light to the point where it feels like every level is set on the moon, but not heavy enough where the player feels like making jumps is absolutely impossible, or feels a little bit cheated when you don't land a jump that you are more than sure that you cleared. Also returning is the idea of an overarching hub world that offers a selection of levels to choose from, each of them locked behind the completion of the previous. When I was getting the general community opinion of this game for the video, I found that a lot of players did not like Traveler's Tales' rendition of the hub. There were a lot of complaints regarding the general backdrop and feel of the area, with a lot of those expressing that it felt bland and lifeless. Although I can see the dislike for it, when I looked at it in a deeper way, I actually enjoyed this hub world.
What is the status of the new portal chamber you've been working on?
It's almost finished.
The opening cutscene sets up that Coco built this entire place with her bare hands, which is an amazing way to give such huge character development in what can be seen as a throwaway sentence for the purpose of the plot. Although the environment itself isn't as colourful and nice to look at as it is in Crash Warped or Crash 2, at least this one has a reason to be here, as opposed to this was here the whole time, it's only convenience to us now. Another recurring concept is the level themes. As we're all familiar with, Crash Warped introduced the vision of each section being set in a different time period to match the game's time-traveling premise. In the Wrath of Cortex, instead of different time periods, each section's respective boss inspires it, in this case being the 4 elemental masks. My only issue with this is that I wish the theming did have a little bit more effort put into it, since Crash Warp sections had some very solid designs to directly correlate with it, whereas this game simply puts some rain on the water mask levels, or sets fire to the fire mask levels, and calls it a day. I am happy the themes do match with their respective masks, but putting more emphasis on the elemental that control that area would have been a nicer touch. Entering stages is also a little bit of a letdown. Instead of previous games where there's some sort of animation from Crash as he enters those levels, it's been devolved to a simple disappearing act as he's teleported from the hub to the start of that stage. While it's not a bad transportation by any means, as I said in my Crash Bash video, when a developer is passed on an IP as big as Crash Bandicoot, that developer should aim to meet those expectations. Attempting to enter the stage, the player is intercepted by the first elemental mask, Rocco.
What are you looking at, fuzzhead? I'm Rocco, the Earth Elemental. Uka Uka and Dr. Cortex woke me from my captive slumber, and now I'm free to pulverize whatever gets in my way. Oh, don't even think about collecting those crystals, Runt. Because if you do, I'm gonna bury you alive.
Rocco's element is in the name, being the avatar of the Earth. His design is also a cool one. The problem with this, however, is due to the game's textures having a waxy appearance, Rocco's design looks more wood-like in appearance than it does stone. The voice actor of Rocco in this game, to my absolute surprise, is Thomas F. Wilson, most known for his role as Biff Tannen and his ancestors in the Back to the Future franchise. The first stage of the game is called Arctic Antics, throwing us into the ice-based stages that haven't been seen since Crash 2. Compared to previous Crash games where the first stage has been centered around a beach, jungle, or generally a lush environment, I can appreciate Traveler's Tales breaking the status quo and having the introduction level be a different one than we're used to. The design and atmosphere of the stage is also greatly improved compared to older entries, with a constant flurry of snow that shows just how powerful the new generation of consoles was at the time. Moving through the stage is also a great change of pace, as it offers a wide range of different environments that still hold the core values of an ice-based level. Slowly starting from an area that clearly has man-made influence, as the stage moves on, the player is taken deeper into the wilderness, going through untouched ice caves filled with penguins. The stage also offers a large number of obstacles for us to go up against, such as wide gaps to jump across and thin ice paths surrounded by freezing cold water. Once again returning are the bonus levels, which I really don't have too much to say about. In my Crash 3 video, I said that I much preferred 3's bonus rounds over 2's, because they felt more organically part of the world they're in, almost being extensions of them instead of being tucked away. This opinion holds the same fact for the Wrath of Cortex, since I feel like Traveler's Tales have taken the idea of if it's not broken, don't fix it, very seriously for their first entry. Partway through the level, we collect our first crystal, which is something I briefly wanted to touch on. In the opening cutscene of the game, it's made clear that these crystals are completely different from the ones we've become accustomed to collecting since Crash 2. The game goes as far as calling them elemental crystals as opposed to power crystals, since it's implied that after the events of Crash Warped, there are no power crystals left to find. My problem with this is the fact that the crystals themselves retain the exact same design. I understand that it's there for familiarity purposes, since as I just said, we as the player have become familiar with collecting purple glowing items, but I would have liked to have seen a different design to set the two types apart. I'm not saying completely change the way they're shaped, but something as simple as changing the color palette of them, or even changing the color to represent that section's mask or element, would have been a lot more refreshing and would have been great for attention to detail. Reaching the end of the stage, we're done with the introductory portion of the game. As I've said in the past, Naughty Dog did a great job of having the first level being a tutorial, without the vibe that it was a tutorial. This is something that I feel Traveler's Tales have nailed to an absolute T. Having the opening level throw an absolute flurry of new enemies and obstacles at the player leaves them feeling like they're being set up for a gauntlet, and once they've surpassed that gauntlet, they feel like they're ready for absolutely anything the game wants to put them up against. It's a fantastic way to remain faithful to what Naughty Dog has done in the past, while also setting up their own variation of it and making sure they stand under their own spotlight. Once we're done with Arctic Antics, we're able to move on to the next stage, which is Tornado Alley. Tornado Alley brings back one of my personal favourite level concepts from Crash 3, allowing the player to take control of a plane and destroy various obstacles placed throughout the level. As opposed to blimps or other planes, Tornado Alley puts the player up against a bunch of tornado generators created by Cortex, which all need to be destroyed by the player to obtain their crystal. The environment of the stage is also a great one, taking the player into stormy darkness as leaves flow across the screen, making us feel like we're actually in the thick of things. The stage is a massive improvement on its previous renditions and a fantastic new way to showcase the new engine that this game operates on, but it's also not without its issues. Although I could just be being nitpicky, I am disappointed that Crash's character model remained the same for this level type. In the level Mad Bombers from Crash 3, Crash was given aviator sunglasses and the general appearance of someone who was driving an aeroplane during a war. However, in the Wrath of Cortex, his design remains the same as any other level, taking away from the attention to detail. It's not a huge problem that fundamentally affects the game for me, but once again, it would have been nice to have more care put into it. Level 3 is called Bamboozled, which begs the question, what came first, the Crash level or the Rooster Teeth line? The stage is definitely one of my favourite ones for this entry, but it also does have some things that cause concerns. Instead of controlling Crash like we normally would, we're instead put into a hamster ball. Although it's actually called an Atlas Sphere, I had to go out of my way to Google what it was, so I'm going to keep calling it a hamster ball. Even though it is a different way to control Crash than we're used to, it thankfully isn't a horrible one, and matches the idea of the level rather well. The stage takes us through various obstacles, such as steep ramps and long downward hills that can cause us to lose control at the last second. But thanks to the smoothness of the way the hamster ball controls, it never feels like a death was undeserved once the player gets a feel for the way the vehicle handles. The environment and design of the stage is also very faithful to its name, taking the player through a bamboo forest on platforms that are, well, built with bamboo, and is a great original level design brought to the table by the developers. My concern with this level doesn't lay within the level itself, but rather the way it alludes to the number of vehicles we'd end up controlling in this game, with 2 of the first 3 levels already having the player take control of an object in some way or another. With Bamboozled behind us, the player enters level 4, Wizards and Lizards. The stage opens up with us being in a castle and various returning enemies in our way, such as the Knight Lab Assistant from Crash 3, as well as the Wizard Lab Assistant from the same game. When it comes to the stage's environment, its sheer scale is absolutely massive, and it's one of those rare moments where I truly believe that bigger is better in terms of level design. As the player carries on through the level, various tropes from previous Crash games also return, such as the transition from a third-person view to a side-scrolling one, and gives a greater depth to its design. Deeper into the stage, a chase sequence occurs, bringing back another concept that is a staple of the Crash series. During this section, the player is forced to run from their biggest threat yet, in this case a dragon, as they dodge and jump over various pits and obstacles to make it out alive. With these things merged into one level, combined with the soundtrack of this stage, it truly feels like it is one of the best levels in the Crash series, and one that I hold in very high regard. Finishing off level 4 takes us to the final stage of the first warp room, Compactor Reactor. This is a stage that, while I do enjoy it for what it is, feels way too big for its own boots. The stage opens up with Crash in the desert, with no other way to go but forward and jump onto a minecart. This level introduces a sort of on-rails opening portion, and even though I appreciate it and it shows off what the game has to offer, it feels kind of unnecessary to me when you consider that the level itself has nothing to do with the opening theme. It would have been much better if Traveler's Tales had given the minecart section its own dedicated stage, as the transition from railcart to immediate underground lab feels very sloppy. Once the player reaches the end of their path, the game throws them straight into the reactor and forces them to make their way through an onslaught of obstacles such as lab assistants, laser-guarded conveyor belts, and the returning pistons from Crash 2. To take things even further, the bonus round in this stage is absolutely massive compared to previous stages and drags on longer than it needs to be. The environment does match the level well, but it matches it too late, as the opening sequence does ruin the experience for me and seems to be there just because it could be, which in turn creates a level that feels like it was just long and unenjoyable to get through. With the completion of the last level, we can now challenge our first boss in the game, Crunch. Crunch is powered by the previously mentioned rock elemental Rocco, and despite being powered by a rock elemental, the boss battle is quite lackluster to say the least. The fight throws Crash into the hamster ball and Crunch into a hollow rock sphere, as they go against each other in what realistically just is a glorified game of marbles. While Crunch can deal damage to Crash by simply slamming into him, the player must avoid the attacks as they roll around the arena and hit various small boulders that roll around randomly. Once all the boulders have been colored blue, they'll fly into the sky and damage Crunch by breaking open his sphere. This process is repeated 3 times, as usual, with each passing phase getting more and more difficult, if you can even call them phases. In the past, there was always something extra in between boss phases, whether that boss moved faster or threw more attacks your way. But for this fight, it seems that the only addition of difficulty was adding more of the item we needed to damage Crunch to pad it out. The idea of taking an all-powerful element and resorting its attack method to simply rolling around and damaging the player is something that I don't really enjoy, and while I can see its appeal, I feel that Rocco's potential was done some injustice. Beating Rocco grants us our first ability and a returning concept from Crash Warped. Unlike Crash Warped, where the first ability was the supercharged body slam, this game gives us an even more useless ability, which is the ability for Crash to sneak. The main idea of this ability is to allow Crash to sneak on top of nitro crates, which will stop them from exploding and help with traversing through stages. My problem with this is the fact that more often than not, the nitro crates we can actually sneak on are usually found in bonus rounds, ending in the ability to not being used all too often. I will say that the rest of the abilities offered in this game are actually used a lot more than they were in Crash Warped, with the sneak ability being the one exception to that rule. Before we have a chance to enter level 1 of Warp Room 2, we're interrupted by the next element, Wawa the Water Elemental.
Crash Bandicoot, you've got some nerve setting foot into my domain without an invitation. Don't talk back to me. I'll fix that attitude problem of yours.
Wawa's personality is a bit of a mixed bag, as he presents himself in a rather militaristic fashion, which from my point of view, doesn't really represent the element of water realistically, as I've always perceived water as more calm. It can be argued that it's more representative of the randomness that water can have, but I don't want to look too deep into it. Wawa's voice actor is Ronald Lee Ermey, a voice actor who would go on to voice various other characters in a variety of TV shows, all in the same military style. The first stage of Warp Room 2 is Jungle Rumble, which, as you can pick by the name, is set in a jungle environment. The environmental design of the stage is a nice one. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but just like Arctic Antics and Tornado Alley, Jungle Rumble brings some amazing depth to the design with its weather systems in place, giving a rich atmosphere to the feeling of being in a secluded rainforest. My problem with this level isn't from an environmental standpoint, but a gameplay one. The level opens up like any normal one, with Crash running through the jungle as he smashes crates and spins away enemies. But at about the halfway point, the stage gets a little more interesting to say the least. During our on-foot escapades, we're given yet another vehicle to drive, which is a Jeep. Shortly after taking control of the vehicle, the stage then transitions into another chase sequence, with a herd of rhinoceros hellbent on taking Crash down. This is where my problem arises. Out of the 6 levels the players have been through so far, 3 of them have had us take control of a vehicle in one way or another, or 4 if you count the opening portion of Compact the Reactor. I can't help but feel that Traveler's Tales were given tunnel vision when it came to having access to these vehicles. While I understand that Crash 3 did have a load of vehicles for us to control, the levels that had them were spread far enough from each other that it wasn't immediately obvious that we had so many things to ride or drive. Unfortunately, the next level, Seashell Shenanigans, seems to suffer from the same effect as Jungle Rumble. The stage within itself is a clear reference to the levels from Crash Warp, such as Under Pressure and Deep Trouble, putting us in an underwater environment that is much more fleshed out than we're used to. Unlike the aforementioned Crash Warp levels, where the levels felt like they took place in shallow water, Seashell Shenanigans does a great job of giving the player the feeling of being deep underwater, featuring a variety of enemies such as diving lab assistants and giant jellyfish, which can be an issue to dodge. Moving through the stage gives a breathtaking environment, taking us from man-made pressure tunnels all the way through to rainbow-coloured coral that leaves it feeling like a lush underwater jungle. Towards the end of the stage, however, it's once again tarnished by the idea of being given yet another vehicle to control. Instead of giving us the returning submergible from Crash Warped, which would have been a much preferred mode of transportation, we're instead put into a generic yellow submarine that can shoot rockets and drop mines. Not only that, but unlike the submergible, which felt like it was very responsive and easy to control, the submarine feels extremely janky and tight with its controls, more often than not ending in the player trying to turn at the last second, only for the physics to carry them straight into the arms of an enemy. The level's introduction is a wonderful and appreciated callback to previous underwater stages, but with the latter half of the stage being resorted to unoriginality and another form of mechanic recycling, it does make the experience a poor one. Thankfully, level 3 of Warp Room 2, Banzai Bonsai, is a very welcome change of pace. This is the first level in the game where we're able to take control of Coco, which is something I love to see returning. In this game, the transition from Crash to Coco is different from Crash Warped. Instead of Crash falling through the warp tunnel and then Coco walking in behind him, the transition happens during the loading screen. Coco knocks Crash out of the way and the player takes control of her, leading into the stage. It's no real secret that in the past, I've been very critical of Coco's levels, especially in Crash Warped. However, for the Wrath of Cortex, it seems that Traveler's Tales took it upon themselves to improve them greatly. The stage itself is amazing. throwing the player into a Japanese theme with a variety of enemies that complement its theme greatly, such as ninjas that will appear from smoke randomly, and koi fish that will jump from the water platforms we try to traverse across. This is also the first time in the series that the player can control Coco completely on foot, and although it can be argued that you can control Coco on foot at the start of the poorer levels in Crash Warped, and throughout the minigames in Crash Bash, it's best to not be caught up on semantics. Interestingly enough, despite every Coco level in Crash Warped having a vehicle to take control of, there isn't a single one to be seen in this stage, which is something I'm not about to complain about. The addition of expanding Coco's moveset is also a welcome one, since it adds further development to her character and how different she is to play as opposed to Crash, while also maintaining the core gameplay style that we've become used to. The name of the next stage is called That Sinking Feeling, which, to no one's surprise, is another vehicle level that more or less is a clone of Tornado Alley. Unlike Tornado Alley, where our main objective was to destroy tornado generators while driving a plane, this stage's objective is to destroy the various ships around the map. Unfortunately, the vehicle we're given control of in this level is called the Firefly, and despite its cool design, it drives and feels just like the aeroplane, which is a bit disappointing. The only positive I can give this stage is the fact that Crash is actually wearing some goggles this time, which is a nice little attention to detail. The environment itself is also a neat one, and one that I can appreciate in terms of atmosphere and the chaotic feel of constant bullets firing towards the player. But I do wish that this level had come a little later in the game, considering that we've only had one on-foot stage in between two vehicle levels. Getting rid of that sinking feeling, we go into the final stage of Warp Room 2, H2O. This level is highly disappointing to say the least. Not only are we given control of a submarine straight off the bat, but the design of the stage pales in comparison to Seashell Shenanigans, simply just throwing enemy after enemy at us with no rhyme or reason as to why, almost feeling as it's attempting to make the level longer. This is even more apparent when about halfway through the level, the player is instantly thrown out of the submarine and onto land, transitioning into a regular Crash level. The last half of the stage is genuinely magnificent, bringing back the electrified water from stages such as Sewer or Later from Crash 2, and feels like an actual challenge. However, just like Compactor Reactor, the opening sequence centered on a vehicle completely ruins the last half of the level, and once again, I truly feel that the vehicles should have their own dedicated stages instead of just being merged into existing ones. The end of H2O brings us to the second boss fight. While this boss fight is a stronger contender than Rocco's, it still does have its fair share of problems. Just like Rocco's fight, the way Crunch attacks is just overall confusing, since instead of just using the watery surroundings to attack Crash, he simply throws a variety of energy waves. Crunch's overall design is very appealing, and actually matches the elemental he's drawing power from, but it seems that's the only indicator that his elemental is the water elemental. There is a small portion of the fight where he will cause the water to bubble in between platforms that can damage the player, but outside of that, there's no real water-based attacks that drive home that we're taking on the literal embodiment of water. Just like Rocco, I feel that the elemental basis of Wawa was poorly executed, with the only redeeming factor being the overall design of Crunch. Beating Crunch gives us the next ability, the double jump, a returning ability from Crash Warped which is actually used a lot more frequently in this entry as opposed to its predecessor. Once we're all wrapped up with the second warp room, it's time to move on to Warp Room 3. Heading into the first level, as usual we're introduced to the next mask. This warp room's elemental is Pyro, the fire elemental.
I realize my brethren have had some trouble with you, my little orange friend, but I'm not quite sure why. Is it getting hot in here? Is it safe to be wearing that fur? It looks flammable!
Similarly to Wawa, Pyro's personality seems a little odd to me, as he's rather calm, collected, and level-headed, which is not what you'd expect from an element such as fire. Just like Rocco's voice actor, I was absolutely blown away when I realized that the person portraying Pyro is actually Mark Hamill, who not only is Luke Skywalker, but has since gone on to voice a huge catalogue of characters, such as Master Ericus from the Kingdom Hearts series, and more importantly, the Joker from the Batman animated series. The first stage, titled The Gauntlet, delivers as expected and definitely lives up to its name. This stage does not hold back its obstacles and enemies, immediately opening up with trapdoors that will open if lingered on for too long, and swinging axes that will cut Crash down to size if not noticed fast enough. As the player progresses through the stage, the increasing difficulty is noticed, requiring them to speed past spiked walls and avoid rolling cannonballs that are lit aflame. All these elements combine to create a real challenge that feels strategically placed at a healthy point in the game. Just like Banzai Bonsai, the stage truly leans into its own through its environmental design being a dungeon in Cortex's castle, and is one of the greatest examples of a true gauntlet in the Crash series, at least until Crash 4, but that's something we'll talk about in a future video. Surviving the gauntlet takes us through to the next stage, Tsunami, which is also the second stage allowing the player to take control of Coco. Normally I'd skip this level considering it isn't an extension of Banzai Bonsai with a lot of returning assets, but the stage has enough originality to stand on its own. During a chase sequence, the player must run away from a tsunami to survive and complete the level. Unlike other stages in the past where we've run from things such as bears, dinosaurs and dragons, introducing a more natural element to these kinds of things is honestly refreshing, and having Coco attempt her escape on a scooter of all things is a pretty funny addition. The only thing that annoys me about this level is its placement, as it would have made much more sense to place this stage style in Wawa's domain, considering that it is a level based around escaping from raging water. Beating Tsunami segues the player into a pure vehicle stage, Smokey and the Bandicoot. This stage is another returning concept from Crash Warped, throwing the player into a race against enemies in a similar way to Road Crash and Hog Ride. In my Crash Warped retrospective, I made a note of how tight the controls were for the bike in those stages, and in Smokey and the Bandicoot, I had the complete opposite problem. The controls for the Jeep in this stage are extremely loose, making it very hard to turn in any capacity and leaving the stage feeling very unsatisfactory. The thing that strikes me as odd is the fact that the controls of the Jeep were actually done very well in the stage Jungle Rumble, whereas they are completely butchered in this level, leaving me to wonder why the change was made. Another interesting thing in this level is the fact that the enemies we're racing against are actually previous bosses from throughout the series, such as Dingodile and Tiny Tiger. This is a theme that's common within this game, with various bosses appearing as generic enemies in not only this stage, but also other ones throughout it. I don't quite know how to feel about this, as I am a little disappointed at the fact that previous big bads have been resorted to being nothing but a roadblock, but I can also appreciate that Traveler's Tales did this to give an indicator of just how strong Crunch and his allies are. The next stage is Eskimo Roll, which is practically a copy of Bamboozled with a change of scenery. The stage does a good job of adding obstacles for the player to deal with in this new mode of transportation, adding random holes to dodge around, penguins to bowl away, and also uses Tiny Tiger as a literal roadblock, further strengthening my statement about bosses being used as cannon fodder. The main thing that sets Eskimo Roll apart, at least for me, is the addition of rotating platforms towards the end of the stage that can really catch the player off guard if not handled correctly, but are also forgiving enough to give little slots for the atmosphere to help us if we've underestimated our speeds. Overall, it's a great level, and perhaps even more enjoyable than Bamboozled itself, since it adds an extra layer of flair and dynamic to the hamster ball we've gotten used to so far. Moving on to the final stage of Warp Room 3, we have Fahrenheit Frenzy, an iteration of a level style that I was happy about being absent completely from Crash Warped. Fahrenheit Frenzy is a variation of the jetpack levels from Crash 2, which if you watch that video, you know exactly how I feel about these stages. Although I'm not a fan of these levels at all, I will give credit where credit's due. Traveler's Tales actually did their very best to improve on a formula that was sorely lacking, and as a result, the stage itself is leagues above what we were given in Crash 2. The controls are smooth and responsive, with the only downfall being the confusing control schematic, but I am willing to chalk that down to a genuine skill issue on my behalf, so I won't be harsh. The environment of the stage is also rather well designed, and while it doesn't have a whole lot going on for it or is nice to look at, from an obstacle design standpoint, it does use the idea of a hovercopter to its fullest potential. The end of the stage takes us through labs, similar to the ones found in Compactor Reactor and H2O No, and also introduces a new kind of crate for the player to destroy, the Invisibility Crate. Once picked up, the crate allows the player to pass through the various lasers throughout the level, which is some amazing attention to detail because a laser simply travels through something that technically isn't there, as there's no light to reflect. Even though I've been very vocal about too many levels having a vehicle to on-foot transition system, this one does get points from me simply because there were very clear improvements on a previously broken level concept. Finishing off the stage will take us to our third boss fight against Crunch, this time powered by Pyro. The boss fight itself is arguably the most in-depth one so far, requiring the player to initially run away from Crunch as he throws flaming boulders at us while we need to outspeed the wall of flames coming our way. Once on the other end, we're able to take control of yet another vehicle in the form of a mech, which allows us to spray Crunch with water in order to damage him. Even though the boss fight is extremely fun, the mech section is a little off-putting for me. It's not because it's a mech, but because when I played this section, I found it a little hard to actually hit Crunch. There's no real indicator that the mech moves faster when you're not using the spray mechanic, and while I don't expect to be handheld, it would have been nice to have a kind of walking animation when you're spraying, but a sprinting animation when you're not. I understand that the mech animation does physically slow down slightly, but when you're actually trying to pay attention to the enemy in front of you, it can be kind of hard to miss. Out of all the mask designs for Crunch, Pyro's is definitely my favourite, with his cracked and lava-like appearance really going all in, representing a flame element that really does make the fight a worthy one, and the first time I felt an elemental design was done justice. Once we've extinguished Pyro, we gain access to our next power-up, which is the Death Tornado Spin, another returning power-up from Crash Warp, allowing Crash to spin more aggressively and glide across large gaps. Moving on to Warp Room 4, we're introduced to the final mask of the game, Lolo the Air Elemental.
The Crash Bandicoot, eh? Oh, I've heard so much about you, and this is the hero I have to blow away? Ha! Seems like a bunch of hot air to me.
Unlike previous masks, Lolo's portrayal is the one that does match the idea of the element he's representing, giving an aura of something that has immense strength but will only be used when absolutely necessary. Lolo is portrayed by Jess Harnell, an actor who coincidentally would go on to voice Crash for many years to come, starting with Tag Team Racing and ending with the Insane trilogy. Level 1 of Warp Room 4 has the simple name Avalanche, and is the third time we're able to control Coco. The stage itself is a recycled concept from the stage Tsunami, and not one that has all too much to speak about. The snowy backdrop from Arctic Antics and Eskimo Roll return, taking the player from the foot of the mountain and slowly moving them up to its peak, which is a neat little addition to the stage. Outside of that, the stage doesn't have too much to offer in terms of its design, simply replacing the Tsunami with an avalanche and the scooter with a snowboard. The chase sequence does offer a cool minigame by offering the player to ski through some slalom flags, but it's not really creative enough for me for the level to stand out by any means. The next stage is Droid Void, a contender that starts strong but really doesn't offer up all too much towards the end. The stage opens up with Crash in a space station and takes the player through some amazing obstacles, such as rotating lasers and enemy lab assistants, and even goes as far as bringing back the great traversal from the likes of Hang 'em High from Crash Warps and Sewer or Later from Crash 2. Moving further along the stage also electrifies those greats, forcing the player to make split-second decisions when it comes to their traversal, or risk being sent back to their checkpoint box. Towards the end of the stage, the player can control a similar mech to the one from Pyro's boss fight, only this time it acts similar to the Wumpa Bazooka power-up from Crash Warped. The addition of this is what ruins the stage for me, because the level could have stood so well on its own, and started very strong to really utilize Crash's platforming. The introduction of the mech immediately taints it by throwing the player into yet another vehicle that isn't built for any form of platforming, but instead just intended to mow down enemies. The stage itself could have highly benefited from either the complete removal of the mech or having the stage placed before Pyro's boss fight, since it wouldn't have felt as cheap if we had been introduced to it earlier. Advancing to Crash Droids, the player takes control of Coco once again, despite the name having the word Crash. Similarly to that sinking feeling and Tornado Alley, this level takes us from the skies and places us in space as the player needs to destroy Cortex's various space stations to gain their crystal. The level overall is nothing more than a clone of the previous air-based stages I've mentioned, and really just feels like it's serving as a filler level more than anything, bringing nothing original to the table whatsoever besides the setting and environment it takes place in. Unfortunately, the next level, Coral Canyon, is given the exact same problem that Crash Droids offers. Unlike Seashell Shenanigans, where the player starts in a diving suit and moves on to a submarine, this stage does the complete opposite, and just like Crash Droids, is devoid of any originality whatsoever. Forcing ourselves through Coral Canyon thankfully takes us to a final level of Warp Room 4, Weathering Heights. On a not so thankful note, however, Weathering Heights takes the environment that was found in Fahrenheit Frenzy and removes the fiery backdrop from it. Although I am grateful at this point in the game to finally receive a stage that doesn't have a vehicle transition or a vehicle in general, it was also at this point in the game that I felt like Traveler's Tales was beginning to run out of gas in their creativity tank. Like I've said in many Crash videos so far, I've been very vocal about asset recycling in general throughout the Crash games. In the past, at least Naughty Dog made an attempt to make it feel as original as they could by adding new enemies or ways to traverse those levels, whereas Traveler's Tales kind of just takes those levels and changes up tiny things such as a backdrop or the order in which you are given a vehicle. This may not be noticed in the moment by the player, but when it sets in, it truly does feel like a cheap and scummy tactic. Weathering Heights doesn't necessarily add anything new or of value to the variation, and as such, it doesn't feel like a very fun stage to play. Once we're finished with this stage, we move on to the fourth boss fight against Crunch as is powered by Lolo. The battle entails the player being put into a plane to take on Crunch in his air form, forcing us to dodge and weave the various attacks that he throws our way. The general design of Crunch is a nice one, but also a confusing one, since he more accurately represents the look of a genie or a ghost as opposed to an avatar of air. Crunch's attack method also seems to make little sense, since the only real air-based attack he seems to use is in the form of an electricity orb, with the rest of the attacks being energy-based just like Wawa's were. My personal favourite addition to this boss fight is the fact that when Crunch takes damage, his skeletal structure appears, giving a nice indicator that the player is hurting him, since there's no real other way to know. I am disappointed that the boss fight was another one to depend on the crutch of a vehicle, but I can acknowledge it was done well for what was envisioned. Defeating Lolo gives the player the Wumpa Bazooka ability from Crash Warped, unfortunately another recycled power-up from a previous entry. With the last of the four elementals defeated, the final stretch begins for the player, taking us through to the final warp room. Interestingly enough, while every previous warp room opens up with a mask to belittle Crash, Warp Room 5 brings Cortex into the fray.
Well, here we are again. I wouldn't necessarily call this irony, but don't you find it a little odd that we keep meeting under these same world domination circumstances? Why not just give up? And let me win for once!
Don't worry, Dr. Cortex. Now that my elemental powers have reached maximum capacity, this little geek is gonna wish he was never created.
The first level, Crash and Burn, is a stage that is a very welcome one, being the first level that is completely original in design and theme in a long time. A nice little piece of trivia to note is the fact that this stage was actually the first ever stage designed for the Wrath of Cortex, dating all the way back to the initial pitch of the game after Crash Bandicoot Worlds was scrapped. The level starts simple, putting the player onto the outskirts of an island with various platforms to traverse across as they slowly move inland. As the stage carries on, the background gets more and more dark, with fireballs raining from the sky thanks to the previously unseen active volcano in the background. Once the initial threat is realized, the environment also changes even further, bringing man-made machinery into the mix, showing that the volcano is active, just not by any natural means. This stage is honestly extremely well crafted in terms of its platforming and its environment, and sets a bar that I really wish was present in so many other levels of the game. Proceeding to the next stage, we also have one of the better ones in the game, Gold Rush. Just like Crash and Burn, Gold Rush has many things that really set it a cut above the rest. This level is set in an old western time period, taking Crash through various western towns, and towards the middle section of the stage, a massive gold mine that is genuinely a great addition. The environment and general atmosphere of the level really does encapsulate the idea of being in a western town, and even though we're given another vehicle to take control of within the stage, it's not only for a very short time, but is also something within the stage that actually feels like it belongs there. My only real issue with this stage isn't really one that I feel that's valid, but I feel like thematically speaking, this level would have been much better placed in Crash Warped considering its time travel nature. But like I said, it's not really valid and more of a wishful thinking type of deal. Overall, the level honestly has a little bit of everything, and strikes such an amazing balance between all the concepts the game has offered so far up until this point. The following stage, Medieval Madness, is for all intents and purposes a recycled version of Bamboozled and Eskimo Roll, and doesn't offer much to discuss. It doesn't really bring anything new for the character, and even though I do like these kinds of stages, I feel that having a third hamster ball level is a bit much, especially when there's only 25 levels in the core story. Level 4 of Warp Room 5 takes us to Crate Balls of Fire, which suffers the exact same problem that levels such as Coral Canyon and Compactor Reactor do. The stage opens up in an environment similar to Droid Void, putting the player on a space station, and just like Droid Void, actually opens up quite strong. This level tries to set itself apart by mixing it up with a chase sequence, forcing the player to run away as a massive fireball threatens to end their run. My issue is that the mech seems so unnecessary as an addition to the stage. It feels as if just because it was a space station level, the mech needed to return, which isn't the case at all, and if the mech was left in only this level and removed from Droid Void, it could have been such a strong contender in the roster of stages. Moving on from Crate Balls of Fire puts the player into the final stage of the game, Cortex Vortex. This level takes stage on Cortex's space station, and is a great return to an environment we've fought in so many times previously. Just like the Gauntlet, the stage is an absolute onslaught of enemies, obstacles, and challenges that leads the level to be placed extremely well, and truly feels like a final boss path. In comparison to previous Crash games, the stage also tries its best to make sure the player utilizes all the power-ups they've collected so far, which is a nice change of pace when you consider that in Crash Warped, the power-ups felt extremely unnecessary and weren't used all too often at all. There's also a section in this stage that brings a nice callback to the stage Bug Light from Crash 2, giving the player a full stack of Aku Aku masks that can light up the path ahead of them, and gives them the pleasure of running through a path littered with nitro crates, which once again adds to the overall feeling that we are reaching the end of our journey, and everything we've learned is actually paying off. With the completion of the last level, we're granted access to the final boss fight of the game. Differently from other boss fights where Crunch is powered by a particular element, the best part about this boss fight is the fact that all the elementals actively fight without the need to power up anything else. The fight itself is set in 4 stages, with each phase as usual raising in difficulty, by also bringing in an extra mask element into the fray, eventually culminating in a combination of all 4 elements appearing to kill the player. Rocco's mode of attack is causing boulders to fall from above, which matches his element much more than it did in the first boss fight. This notion also holds true for Wawa's mode of attack, throwing in balls of ice that can instantly freeze Crash if left unchecked. Pyro's attacks cause the floor to light a flame, which matches his element perfectly, and Lolo's causes various chain lightning attacks that also cover the floor. It was in this boss fight that I truly felt it was the first time in the game that each element was actually executed extremely well, and it was a shame it wasn't done sooner in the runtime. The way the player does damage is to simply wait for the elements to power down, which will then prompt Aku Aku to come in and stun Crunch, allowing the player to shoot him with the Wampa Bazooka. This causes Crunch to throw Cortex into the middle section, providing an opening to attack. The idea of Aku Aku coming in to actively help against the boss is a very nice touch, and the fact that the player is forced to use a power-up to actually progress, especially in a boss fight, is something I'm happy about since it feels like the power-up was actually warranted as an addition to the game. This boss fight truly feels like a payoff and a well-deserved victory after the run, and has no real negatives for me to pick on. Beating Cortex and Crunch gives us the closing cutscene.
Can't you ever let me win? What do you want from me, you cretin?
Cortex! You realize that Crash may have collected all the crystals, but he doesn't have the gems. With the gems, we can resurrect the masks one last time and destroy that Bandicoot once and for all.
If the player aims for 100% completion, they'll be granted a true ending cutscene, which sets up the next entry Crash Nitro Cut rather nicely and explains Crunch's presence on Team Bandicoot.
Can't you ever let me win? What do you want from me, you cretin? No, Uka Uka, I can explain.
It's too late for that now!
I don't think you should have done that.
Oh, no. Where am I? Hey, wait a second. That annoying scientist doesn't have control over me anymore. Where is that pathetic twerp?
There's no time for that now, Crunch.
Danger. Critical power overload in Evil Space Station. Run for your lives.
I think your energy bolt caused a slight chain reaction. It might be wise if we made our way to the escape pods.
This is all your fault! If you hadn't ducked out of the way, none of this would have happened! This doesn't look good.
Hey, any of you guys need a ride?
Crash, Coco, Aku, I'm grateful to all of you. If it weren't for you, I'd still be under the control of Dr. Cortex. Thank you for believing in me, guys.
You're welcome, Crunch. Hey, do you think that's the last we'll see of Dr. Cortex and Uka Uka?
I'd like to believe that, my children, but somehow I doubt that very much.
Idiot! Fool! Nincompoop! You've landed us in the middle of nowhere!
Ouch! Whoa! No, wait! I can explain! Ah! I'll get my revenge, Crash Bandicoot! Just you wait!
In retrospect, The Wrath of Cortex was an amazing entry into the Crash Bandicoot series. It did suffer from a lot of issues, such as the ridiculous amount of vehicles that were involved, and some rather odd representations of various elements. But it truly was a fantastic return to the platforming formula after so many years of racing and party games for Crash Bandicoot. Although I can understand the hate the game gets for its gameplay and its odd design choices, it's often overlooked that this game wasn't even meant to exist in the grand scheme of things, and fans of the series were quite lucky that they got it at all. Traveller's Tales did so much better at meeting expectations than Eurocom did for Crash Bash, and tried their very best to stand apart while also walking the same path that Naughty Dog paved for them so many years earlier. The ending of The Wrath of Cortex takes us into the next racing game in the series, Crash Nitro Kart, which for me is a vast improvement on Crash Team Racing as a whole. If you reached this far into the video, thank you very much. I appreciate those who stick around until the end and enjoy listening to me ramble on about my favourite games. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Once again, thank you very much, and I'll see you all next time.